Remember in the first lecture series I said that noble women would have to take up arms and fight if their husbands are away? So this is unusual, but it is something that a noble woman should do in the most unusual cases. And Christine de Pizan, she is a medieval writer, French writer, and she says that women has to familiarize themselves with military weapons in case their husband is away and they have to take up arms. So this is what we're going to talk about. And there's a lot of queens in the medieval ages. However, I've decided to focus on the famous, important queens who went to war. So here is queens and warrior women. The first queen is Aethelflaed, and she's not, technically she's not a queen. However, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called her a queen, and many historians view her as such. And she was a Saxon. Aethelflaed is considered to be England's greatest female general, and it is said that she has never lost a battle. And she is known for fighting off renewed Viking attacks. She was the daughter of Alfred the Great of Wessex, and her brother was King Edward the Elder of Wessex. And Aethelflaed's life is often beset by war from a very early age. Her father almost lost the throne and they had to run away when she was 9. However, he eventually gained it back, so throughout her life it was all about war. The Vikings raided much of England in 865, and it set a long period of war between the English and the Vikings. Around 890, Aethelflaed married Ethelred. He's the Lord of Mercia, and he's probably much older than her. Historians guess around 16 years older, so he was pretty old. And before Aethelflaed married, it is stated that she had an excellent education like her brother who would be king, because she knew Latin, because later on she knew how to read and write, and later on her father, he was translating poems from Latin, and she knew the classics like Beowulf. She had a daughter named Elfwin, and the reason why she never had a kid is because after her childbirth, she had a traumatic experience, and from then on she suffered that and never wanted to have another child again in fear of dying. In 911, her husband Ethelred died, and she was recognized as the ruler of Mercia, and she became the Lady of the Mercians, but people call her Queen because she technically was. She wasn't, but people called her Queen because she had to run the kingdom. For the next 7 years, she would prove herself to be a warrior and a leader. Aethelflaed worked closely with her brother, King Edward of Wessex, which later paved the way of unification between Wessex and Mercia, which I'll get to that later. She built a chain of fortified boroughs, including Chester, Bridgenorth, Tamworth, and Stafford. So she set up those fortified sites. And in 916, she led an expedition against Wales, and her troops defeated the Welsh and captured the King of Gwent's wife. And the reason why they went to Wales is for peace between Mercia and England with her brother, or helping. She paved union to that, made peace. She then turned her attention to reconquering parts of Mercia that were under Viking control, and eventually she defeated them at Derby, Leicester, and York. She died at Tamworth in 918. She was about 48. Yeah, she died at 48. So all this happened before she was 48. But at the time, 48 is real old.
Yeah.
Okay. And is buried with her husband at Gloucester. And her daughter became her successor, but her uncle King Edward, he deposed her 6 months later. And the reason for this is because he wanted Mercia for himself and his son. So he wanted to unify England. And Alfwyn was sent to live the rest of her life in a nunnery. So she was forced into a nunnery. Wessex and Mercia became united under King Edward, and he became the first king of England. And one thing I would like to point out about this is that Aethelflaed is the only, historians call her the only sovereign, woman sovereign of England. Before then, there wouldn't be another female sovereign until Mary the First of England. Though there will be one named Matilda, which I will talk about soon. But she is really, like in 1950s, people just discovered her. Before then, she was all forgotten. So, and there are parades and parties for her in England. There's a lot of events named after her, parades, and she's becoming a popular figure, and she's also a main character in romance novels too. And she appears in the famous show The Last Kingdom, if you watch it, that historical show. Alright, Empress Matilda, this is the one who tries to gain her throne of England, who tries to become the female ruler of England. She's known as the Lady of the English. This is what her epitaph reads: great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. They really underestimated or downplayed her role, because this was a woman who would have been Queen of England. See, notice that she is the person who wrote the epitaph shows that she is surrounded by Henry. She was the daughter of Henry the First of England and Matilda of Scotland. At the age of 9, her parents sent her to Germany to become the bride of Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was 16 years older than her, and she eventually married him when she was 12 years old. They had no children, and Henry died years after their marriage. At 23, she was a widow with no role in the German court, and therefore she returned home. And at this point, she returned home, and her father would probably arrange another marriage for her. When her older brother William drowned at sea in 1120, she became the legitimate heir to the English throne. Henry I gathered the court and made the nobles swear allegiance to his daughter. Henry also decided that Matilda should marry again, and he chose Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, to be her husband. And this is because he thinks that Geoffrey Plantagenet may be a good ruler, or that later on he may rise up against Matilda during her reign when she becomes sovereign, because at the time he was very troublesome, very feisty. Everything was his way or no way. He was 12 years younger than her. They really disliked each other, but they produced children, and she gave birth to a son named Henry, who will become the Henry II in 1133. In 1134, Henry I died, and Matilda was pregnant with her third child and could not come to England because she lived in France at the time. This delay gave Henry I's nephew Stephen an opportunity to seize the throne. He was accepted by the people and the nobles, and he was crowned King of England on December 26th. And the nobles that swore allegiance to Matilda all swore allegiance to him because he was a man. Because they didn't want a female ruler on the throne, because there has never been a female ruler, and they forgot all about Aethelflaed and Boudica they weren't forgotten by then. After Matilda gave birth to her third son in July, she began to make plans to get her throne back, and she launched a civil war against King Stephen. And this war became known as the Anarchy, and it lasted almost 20 years. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, Matilda's forces captured King Stephen, and she won. And she was declared Queen Regnant and was given the title the Lady of England and Normandy. However, just before her coronation, like on the eve of her coronation, the city of London rose up against her, and she was forced to flee. And after a series of defeats, she realized that she could not win because the people wanted Stephen instead. Eventually, a treaty was made between Stephen and Matilda that her son, Henry, would become Stephen's heir. And Matilda spent the rest of her life in Normandy, mostly pursuing religious and pious aspects. And this is supposedly the wedding of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet. Eleanor of Aquitaine. This woman was the most powerful woman in the Middle Ages, and also just a few years ago she was once the longest female ruler in history because she ruled Aquitaine at the age of 15, and just recently Queen Elizabeth II surpassed her. So she is the most powerful woman and also the most famous woman of the Middle Ages. Eleanor was the daughter of William X, the Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor. When she was 15, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, and the Duchy of Aquitaine is one of the most richest provinces in France, and this made her one of the most desirable brides in Europe. She married Louis VII of France in 1137, and the couple produced 2 daughters. In 1145, Louis VII answered the Pope's call to go on a crusade, and Eleanor also agreed to accompany her husband. She scandalized all of Europe by leading 300 women and made them dress up as Amazons, and brought 1,000 of her knights from her Duchy of Aquitaine to fight in the Second Crusade. She did not intend to heal women, but insisted on taking part in strategy sessions and sided with her uncle rather than her husband, and this caused tension among them, and it led to a divorce, and the couple divorced in 1152. However, 2 months after her divorce, she married Henry, the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, Matilda's son, and the future Henry II. And it was said that they were having an affair before they were having a divorce. And he was much younger than her. He would also be the future King of England. So this is a wedding of Louis and Eleanor. Upon the death of King Stephen, Henry became King of England. In the early years of marriage, it was happy and successful, and the couple produced 8 children. You know, Richard and John of Robin Hood, they're her children. However, due to Henry II's infidelities, the marriage became strained, and he had a lot of mistresses. One of them is the famous Rosamund, who is popular in romance novels, whom supposedly legend has it he hid her in a maze, and Eleanor had to go through a maze to find her. And another of his famous mistress was her son Richard's fiancée, and that didn't go well. So you can see why Henry II would be, you can see why Eleanor of Aquitaine would be mad at Henry and no longer loved him but detested him. In 1173, she supported her son's rebellion against her husband. This is because their sons wanted the power, and so she supported them to help gain the throne. They lost because Henry, he was more experienced and more of a warrior. He was a better military strategist and general, so they lost. And while Henry II forgave his sons, he did not forgive his wife, and he imprisoned her for 16 years. So she lived under house arrest and imprisoned in many castles, various castles throughout the 16 years. When Henry II died in 1189, Richard II became king, and Richard freed his mother from prison and made her regent while he went on a crusade. And this made Eleanor the most powerful woman because she was running and ruling England in his stead. And after Richard died, Eleanor supported her son John's right to the throne and retired to Fayetteville Abbey, where she took the veil to become a nun, and she died in 1204, and she was around 80 years old.
Wow.
So this is a portrait of Eleanor and Henry II. Okay, the next queen, Isabella of France, and she is known as the She-Wolf. Shakespeare called her the She-Wolf. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV and Joan I of Navarre. Her mom is very famous. She was a ruler in her own right, the first queen of Navarre, and she was very educated, her mother. She was 12 when she married Edward II of England, and he was 23. However, Isabella was often at odds with her husband because her husband was a homosexual and preferred male favorites. And she gave birth to 4 children. Due to her tension with her husband, her children were taken away from her, and she left for France. So she went back home. However, in France, she had a lover named Roger Mortimer, and the two formed an army. In 1327, they invaded England, where they forced Edward to abdicate. There is a debate today about whether Edward II was killed. The traditional way of how he got killed is he died because he was executed with an iron-hot deer antler, and they poked it in his anus. However, historians believe that modern historians, there's a new study, it's still up to debate, believe that he escaped to Italy because there is a letter of a bishop claiming that he's seen him, and many people also claim they saw him. But we're not really sure. This is a very new theory. But the traditional one was he was murdered by stuffing deer antler up his anus. Four years later, Edward III led a coup against Isabella and Roger Mortimer because she was regent and they were powerful at the time. And Roger, he was executed, but he couldn't execute his mom, so he placed his mom under house arrest for 27 years. And she eventually became a nun of the Poor Clares before she died on August 22nd, 1358. So she doesn't really have a good reputation because she's known as the She-Wolf because she supposedly had a lover and killed her husband and took the throne for her son. However, many historians are very sympathetic to her, claiming that she was mostly a victim and that she may not have killed her husband. And she did it all for her son. Okay, female warriors. Matilda of Tuscany, she is known as the Great Countess. She was a powerful Italian landholder and a military strategist who supported Gregory VII during the complicated investiture controversy, which was a confrontation against the Church and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And many historians claim that she and Gregory were lovers because he was like 26 years older than her, but because she was so faithful to Pope Gregory. But most historians are discrediting the claim that they were lovers and think that they did it because to ruin her reputation. All right, Matilda was the youngest daughter of Bonifacio, the Marquis of Tuscany and Count of Reggio, as well as several major northern Italian areas such as Lombardy. After her father was murdered in 1052, her brother and sister also died, and this made her the sole heiress to the kingdom, to the realm. And she was only 8 years old, and her mother Beatrice ruled in her stead because she was made regent. In order to protect her daughter's inheritance, because she was very young and a woman, Beatrice remarried Godfred, the Duke of Upper Lorraine, who had rebelled against the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, and this made Matilda of Tuscany to be pro-papal for life rather than imperialism. So she was more for the Pope rather than the king because of her father rebelling against him, and her family were also for the Pope. And Henry III intervened in papal politics militarily and sought to reform the papacy. Matilda's family were also involved in papal elections. And Matilda's stepfather's brother became Pope. Her family sent armies to support him and his successors in Tuscany, and it was allegedly said that this was the first time young Matilda had first engaged in battle. In 1055, Matilda married her stepbrother Godfred the Hunchback. However, it was not a happy marriage, but she gained power and prestige from him as well as his lands. And the couple immediately separated after her stepfather's death in 1069. Her husband returned to Germany, where he died in 1076, and that year was the same year her mother died. And she also got his lands too. And this made her a formidable ruler, for she did not have only her parents' lands, but also her husband's lands in Lorraine. Thus, her lands extended to both sides of the Alps and the Apennines, so she had a vast land. However, her claim for renown would come when she supported Pope Gregory in the investiture controversy. At the time, the Holy Roman Emperors really had a lot of power over the Pope, and they had the right to appoint bishops. And this led back to when Charlemagne, because he was first appointed the Holy Roman Emperor in 800, and thus the Holy Roman Emperors were seen as divinely ordained by the Church. And Henry used this title to appoint popes himself. And Pope Gregory VII, he worked to ban this practice on Henry III's successor, Henry IV. So Gregory tried to get it banned and try to make it to where the Holy Roman Emperor doesn't interfere on choosing the successor. And after an exchange of heated letters, Pope Gregory decided to excommunicate Henry IV. And in order to retain his authority, Henry had to reconcile with the Pope in a humbling fashion. In January 1076, he walked barefoot in snow in penitent's robes and walked to Matilda's castle of Canossa to beg the Pope for his forgiveness. Pope Gregory lifted his excommunication, and Matilda really didn't have a say in it. However, this reconciliation was short-lived, and Pope Gregory had to excommunicate Henry IV again. And this made Henry IV so mad that he decided to install his own pope and depose Gregory VII. And this is where Matilda gets in. This is her role. During this conflict, Matilda would prove to be a thorn in Henry IV's side. Like, they really didn't get along. She vigorously supported Pope Gregory, and because of her land holdings and her own army, she controlled western access to Rome and became an obstacle to Henry's goals. And Henry learned that he should never have messed with Matilda. Eventually, Henry triumphed and Pope Gregory was exiled to Salerno, where he died in 1085. However, Matilda continued to remain faithful to him. In fact, she married a 17-year-old due to his order, because the 17-year-old had sway over the church. He had influence over the nobles. After Henry installed his own pope, Clement III, he decided to depose Matilda. At Sabora, in 1084, she led armies to aid Pope Gregory's successor, Pope Victor III. Henry tried to oust Matilda again, but he was defeated by her armies at Canossa. And even though Matilda did not get along with Henry III or his son Henry IV, she did reconcile with their son Henry V and bequeathed her lands to him in her will. And throughout her life, Matilda founded 100 churches, monasteries, and hospice. And she is one of the only 3 women to be buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, you can see her tomb. Joanna of Flanders the Fiery. Joanna of Flanders was a Breton noblewoman who fought in the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and this is the start of the 100 Years' War. She was most famous for her siege of Hennebont, which was, according to the chronicler John Lebel, the boldest and most remarkable feat ever performed by a woman, and we'll read some of that later. Joanna was the daughter of Louis, the Count of Revel, and Joan, the Countess of Rethel. She was the sister to Louis, the Count of Flanders. In March 1329, she married John of Montfort, the half-brother of John III of Brittany, and bore him 2 children. When John III of Brittany died, his will has some inconsistencies. So there were problems with his will. There were claimants to the title of the Dukedom of Brittany, and the succession was split between the House of Montfort and the House of Valois. This dispute would lead to a civil war that lasted 23 years. The Duke of Montfort claimed the title of Duke of Brittany. However, King Philip IV did not see John of Montfort, her husband, Joanna's husband, as the Duke of Brittany, and he supported his nephew, Charles de Valois' claim, whose wife was the niece of John III of Brittany. John of Montfort went to Paris to try to persuade the king of his right for the title, but her husband was imprisoned by the king. And so Joanna declared her infant son the leader of the Montfort faction and named him the Duke of Brittany. And she dressed in armor and raised an army, and she captured Reading, a city. She returned to Hennebont Castle to prepare for the siege against Charles de Valois. She sent an emissary to ask King Edward III of England for aid because she was related to the English king. During the siege of the Hennebont Castle, she noticed that her enemy's camp was unguarded, and she charged at it with 300 men. So she only had 300 men in the siege. And she burned their supplies and tents, and this earned her the nickname of the Fiery Joan. So with 300 men, they went and stormed it. However, Charles de Valois cut Joanna and her troops from her retreat, and so they were at a precarious position. They rode to Brest, where they gathered more support, and Joanna eventually returned to Hennebont Castle. And because the people of Hennebont Castle were starving, the Bishop of Lyon tried to persuade Joanna to surrender. Joanna refused. Even though they were starving, she still had her pride and said no. Soon the English ships finally arrived to help her, and Charles de Beauvoir was forced to retreat. So the English finally came to her aid, and everyone is surprised, historians are surprised that she lasted so long. Because Charles would come back, Joanna needed to go to England for more reinforcements. So it was not the end of the war. On her way back to France, they were intercepted by King Louis of Spain, who sided with Charles de Beauvoir. Joanna and the English faced a victorious battle and laid the siege to Rennes. However, neither side was victorious, and it led to a truce in 1343. Joanna's husband was released, but he died 2 years later because of the imprisonment. And war broke out again, and the English still fought for Joanna and captured Charles de Beauvoir. And Joanna and her son eventually had to seek refuge in England. And there she contacted a mental illness, and she never returned to France and died in 1374. And here is what John de Bell said about her. This is an excerpt. And now you shall hear of the boldest and most remarkable feat ever performed by a woman. This, the valiant countess who kept climbing the towers to see how the defense was progressing. All the besiegers had left their quarters and gone forward to watch the assault. She conceived first. She remounted her charger, fully armed as she was, and called upon some 300 men at arms, who were guarding a gate that wasn't under attack, to mount with her. Then she rode out with this company, and they charged boldly into the enemy camp, which was devoid of anyone but a few boys and servants. They killed them all and set fire to everything. Soon the whole encampment was ablaze. So that is the story of the fiery Joan. And now we will talk about another Joan. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and you have to know who she is because she's one of the heroines of the Middle Ages. Joan of Arc was a French saint and a national heroine. This is an interesting how she became a saint, because she was condemned by the church. And she is the only woman condemned by the church that ever became a saint by the church. So this is a very unusual case, and people believe that, historians believe that because of Joan's class and her sex, her gender, this would have been impossible. Like, there was no way she could achieve many accomplishments. And it was almost an impossible task for a woman of her standing and her gender. And she is known to be God's chosen to lead France to victory against the English in the 100 Years' War. In 1415, Henry V of England, he conquered France. And his son, Henry VI, was king of the two countries. And the French heir, the future Charles VII, was trying to find a way to regain his crown. And this is very important with Charles VII, because right before, until Joan had arrived, he was thinking of giving up his crown completely, his right, and move to Spain. So this is a very interesting tale. And Joan was the daughter of poor tenant farmers, Jacques d'Arc and Isabel. She was illiterate, and she took care of the animals and was a seamstress. She was also engaged to be married. However, she stood up against it, and that was the only time she ever disobeyed her parents, was to not marry, and her parents eventually agreed. When she was a young girl, she began to hear voices such as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, Saint Michael, and Saint Margaret. They told her she was the savior of France and had to install Charles as the rightful king. And this is a primary source. This is part of her trial. She is the most documented martyr like you know more about her than any religious figure like Jesus of Nazareth, Muhammad, or the guy that was Buddha. Like there's many document on her because of people were documenting her during the trial. And this is what she said. This is what she said during her trial, and it's pretty good. I was 13 when I had a voice from God for my help and guidance. The first time that I heard his voice, I was very much frightened. It was midday in the summer in my father's garden. I had not fasted the day before. I heard this voice, my right towards the church. Rarely do I hear it without it being accompanied by a light. This light comes from the same side as the voice. Generally, it is a good light. Since I came into France, I have often heard this voice. And when she said this at the trial, the priests were thinking that, oh, this is witchcraft. She's a witch. At the age of 17, Joan left her home to follow the voices that told her to go to Vaucouleurs and contact Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander, and he was Charles VII's supporter. At first, he refused to see Joan, but she was gaining support in the village because they believed that she was the prophesied maid that would come to save France, because it said, the prophecy said, France would be destroyed by a woman, and it's referred to as Charles VII's mother, Queen Isabel, supposedly because she was the one that was for the English, and she claimed that her son, Charles VII, was illegitimate and didn't have a right to the throne. So that's why Charles was weak, because he's supposedly the illegitimate crown prince. And she was supposed to be the maid to save France. Okay, at first he refused to see Joan, but because of the traction she was gaining in the village, he agreed to give her an audience with Charles. And Joan, she cut off her hair and dressed in men's clothes and made the 11-day journey to Chinon, Charles VII's court. And this is interesting because her dressing in men's clothes was a sign of heresy and witchcraft. So, because you weren't supposed to, a woman wasn't supposed to dress like a man. At first, Charles was not certain what to make of her. And this is interesting because when she arrived at the court of Charles VII, Charles was disguised as a regular servant or a nobleman, and she had to go and find out who the real King Charles was. And she says, "My lord, I am here to serve, and I was sent from God to serve you." And remember, Joan had never seen Charles before. However, Charles, even though she was impressed by how she recognized him, he still was not really won over until she went to the court of the ecclesiastics. Joan, she won him over after she recognized him when he was dressed incognito, and after a 2-hour private audience, Charles still had doubts about her and conducted his clergy to examine her. I mean, this is a peasant girl. I mean, why would a king listen to a peasant woman instead of sending her away? I mean, that is why he had the clergy to examine her. And the clergy found nothing disagreeable with her. They said, "How do you know that you were sent from God?" And she said, "Well, just watch me. At the Battle of Orleans, I will show to you that I am who I say I am." And she seemed pious, humble, and chaste, for she would always pray and attend Mass. She was very pious. And before she went to fight in her life, her small life at in the form of Lauralee. She was healing sick people and taking care of the sick. And Charles eventually gave the 17-year-old Joan armor and a horse, and Joan knew how to ride a horse because she was a farmer. She grew up, with horses. And he allowed her to accompany him to Orleans. In May 1429, Joan succeeded in raising a siege at Orleans. She took over English ports and defeated the English at Patay. After much persuasion, Joan finally convinced the crown prince to be crowned at Reims. And Joan stood near him at his coronation, and it was the highlight of her success. In September 1429, Joan unsuccessfully tried to besiege Paris, and this is because Charles brought her back. You see, Charles is not a very good military leader. He was very weak. He brought her back and had her in prison. And that's why they failed. Had he let her conquer Paris, it would have been a much more unified France. In the spring of 1430, Charles sent Joan to Compiègne to confront a Burgundian assault. So she had to confront the Burgundians. During the battle, she was thrown off her horse and was left outside the town gates. And they think the person that closed the gates on her did it on purpose because she was an enemy of England at the time, and Burgundian was an ally of England. And there the Burgundians captured her and eventually sold her to the English for 10,000 francs. The English were eager to destroy her influence and hungered for her death. Like, they really wanted her dead. And Charles made no attempt to rescue her. So Charles, who she helped, abandoned her and wanted nothing to do with her. And this is the only image of Joan of Arc that we have of her contemporary. And this is interesting because this one portrays her as a woman in a dress, which we know she wasn't in a dress, but in men's clothing. And also, the person that doodled her never even seen Joan of Arc. So he was relying on his imagination. And because the English did not want to be responsible for Joan of Arc's death, they turned her over to an ecclesiastical court at Rouen. And she was tried for heresy and witchcraft by French clerics who supported the English. And you know what's interesting is, once when she helped Charles be crowned at Reims, Charles made her a countess, and yet they forgo all the privileges that was due to a noble woman, and they wanted her as a peasant. And when she really should have been tried in a gentler way, doesn't have a lesser sentence, and also be surrounded by women. However, the English really wanted her dead. And it was said that, contemporaries all said that the English wanted her dead, and that had Joan of Arc been for England, she would have been rewarded rather than for France. And she had a lengthy trial and imprisonment. And Joan fought her inquisitors and decided to stay true to her story. And they accused her of witchcraft and heresy because she dressed in men's clothing. She had voices from God. And they think that, she was possessed by the devil. And you can read her trial. It's very interesting with how she stood firm throughout the lengthy trial. And this is some of her excerpts, because they spend every day trying to get her to confess to witchcraft, and she never did until the last moment. And this is what she said. They asked her. All right, the questioner. Do you know if you are in the grace of God? And Joan said, If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest in all the world if I knew that I were not in the grace of God. But if I were in sin, do you think the voice would come to me? I would that every one could hear the voice as I hear it. I think I was about 13 when it came to me for the first time. And then the questioner said, was it God who prescribed to you the dress of a man? And she said, what concerns this dress is a small thing, less than nothing. I did not take it by the advice of any man in the world. I did not take this dress or do anything by the command of our Lord and of the angels. And the questioner said, which do you care for most, your banner or your sword? And she replied, better, 40 times better, my banner than my sword. See, because they're trying to make it sound like she's a witch. And then the questioner asked, in what likeness did St. Michael appear to you? And they are the reason why they asked about the St. Michael, what he did, and as well as other saints like Margaret and Catherine, is because they believed that she was talking to the demons instead of the angels. And they're trying to make her into a heretic and a witch. And she said, I did not see a crown. I know nothing of his dress. And they asked, was he naked? And she said, do you think God has not wherewithal to clothe him? So you can tell that she was very feisty and she had a sense of humor. And throughout her trial, which she was in there for about a year, she always says, I was sent by God, and never did she once recount it. Only when she was sentenced to be turned over to a secular court did she recant her statement. And this was because she was terrified of being burned to death. And she thought that if she calls herself a heretic, then she could be living in a monastery and be able to go to Mass and live her life in a religious life. However, that was not what the priests had in mind. In fact, they imprisoned her she spent the rest of her life up until that point imprisoned in an English prison, and she was constantly, every day, there was a threat of her being raped or molested, and she may even have been beaten. And because of that, she realized that she was tricked, and she said that her regret was she never should have recanted it. And because she was in an English prison, the English still wanted the King of England and his regent, John, the Duke of Bedford, wanted her killed. And so they tricked her by letting her wear men's clothing. And because she wore men's clothing, she was condemned to death. All right. At first, she was condemned to life in prison. However, because she recanted her statements, she was turned over to the secular court, where they condemned her a heretic because she was in men's clothing, and they sentenced her to be burned at the stake. And on May 29th, 1431, Joan was taken to the marketplace at Rouen, where she was burnt at the stake in front of an estimated crowd of 10,000 people. And you know what makes this even sadder? Her parents were there. They were trying hard throughout that time to get her to be released, but they went to her execution, so they had to watch her. So the parents had to watch their daughter being burnt to the stake. That's the sad part. That makes it even more sad because it was her parents and they couldn't do anything but watch her die. And she was 19 years old. And in 1456, Charles VII, who abandoned her to be burned at the stake, finally decided to do something way after her death. He eventually declared her innocent of all charges and declared her to be a martyr. And she was beatified in 1909 and canonized in 1920. So she became a saint. But like I said, she's the only one to have been condemned by the church and became a saint by the same church. John Lasney, or John Hatchett, and she's known as the warrior. And her story is different because this was a peasant woman too. Just like Joan of Arc, they were peasants. 4 decades after the death of Joan of Arc, another peasant girl would earn her name in history by wielding a hatchet during a Burgundian assault. Jeanne, she was a citizen in the town of Beauvais. On June 27, 1472, her town was besieged by Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. When men defending her town were reduced to only 300 men, Jeanne decided that it was time for the women to take over and fight. So Jeanne led a group of French women armed with hatchets against the Burgundian soldiers, and they drove off their attackers and captured their flag. And she was rewarded by Louis XI for her bravery. She later married Colin Pilon, a French bourgeoisie, and her descendants were exempted from taxation, so they didn't have to pay taxes. Her town of Beauvais holds an annual march in her memory in which women walked in front of the men, and this lasted until the 19th century. Okay, so that is the end of the warrior women, and next up will be women writers like Christine D. Pinzon and Hildegard of Bingen. And these are some of the sources I have. And this is the book, The Warrior Queen, is what I have here. And this is a new book, Founder, Fighter, Saxon Queen, Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. This came out recently. And there's another book on Matilda coming out in April. And this is also a new book, Isabella, the Rebel Queen.